Okay, welcome to the second tutorial in comparative text analysis. And if you recall, there were 4 steps, and the first step of which was to unpack the prompt. So let's imagine that you've turned over the paper in the exam and you see this particular prompt. This particular prompt is to do with the pair of text, The Crucible and Year of Wonders, which I know a lot of schools have been looking at. So the first thing that we're going to do when we unpack is just to identify the key parts of the prompt. So I'm going to suggest we isolate compare how, we isolate conflict, we isolate within communities, we isolate and is demonstrated. Okay, so let's just go back to some of these to start with. Okay, compare how is always going to be a question part in the prompt, and demonstrated is always going to be asking you to provide evidence. Okay, now when we talk about evidence, I want you to think of it in terms of stakeholders. Stakeholders are the various parties or individuals or groups or communities or pets or whatever it might be. The stakeholders that are going to be the evidence to support your other ideas and things within the answer. Okay, so then we come to the key parts of the prompt, and in this case we've got 2. And what I'm going to suggest you do to start with is brainstorm some synonyms for these particular keywords. The reason being that by doing so you will prompt your brain to start thinking in terms of the prompt, the ideas, the key things that this prompt is asking us to think about, and it also allows you then to come back later when you're writing the essay to pick words which are relevant and sustain the prompt focus. So writing down some synonyms to start with is a good idea. So let's have a look at something that I've done for that. So here we have a breakdown of how I've gone about brainstorming that idea. So we've got the question word here. We had the first one here, conflict, and then we had the second idea here, communities. So for communities, some synonyms here: society, city, town, village, organization, associations, groups, clans, affiliations. They start to prompt us to think about what kind of communities we're dealing with in our 2 texts, The Crucible and Year of Wonders. And then if we brainstorm conflict synonyms, we can think about internal and external conflict. We can think about arguments, clashes, crisis, discord, dispute, disagreements, and rivalry even. Those are synonyms to do with conflict, and again they may prompt us to think about how they relate to the 2 texts that we're looking at. Okay, now then we extend that kind of brainstorm to thinking about what might cause the kind of conflict or clash or crisis or discord in our 2 texts. And the causes of conflict can be things like rivalry, grudges, jealousy, revenge, certain beliefs, fear, and so on and so on. So we think about what causes conflict, and then we're starting to frame that in terms of the text that we're looking at. Over here, demonstrated is, like I said, to do with evidence, and I'm going to list the stakeholders here: families, relatives, individuals, friends, groups, and leaders. And if we think about the kind of conflict, for example, that exists in The Crucible, it's mainly between individuals, but it's also sort of certain groups, certain families, groups of friends, and so on and so on. So we can start to frame the context of the conflict in that sense. Okay, so after we've done that step and we've got some good synonyms, we've started to brainstorm and think about the context of the prompt in terms of the text, then we come to the idea of linking these ideas to the 2 texts. So that's when we start to think about the themes, the messages, and so on and so on. How these key words and ideas relate to the text that we're looking at. And we always want to make sure that we're keeping some relevancy and accuracy, and that in turn will allow us to progress to step 2, which is when we start to think about the differences and the similarities and the insights of this prompt in context of the two texts. So this is a suggestion of how you might approach unpacking the prompt, just the first step, okay, which allows you then to move on. So let's have another look at another question, just for an example. So let's say you turn over the exam paper and you see this particular prompt. Uncertainty breeds fear, and fear breeds further uncertainty. This is a quote, and then the question is compare how this idea is explored in the text. So, immediately you want to isolate the words. So uncertainty here breeds fear. Okay, so we're talking about this idea that something happens because of something else. And in turn, fear breeds more uncertainty or further uncertainty. Okay, so we've got this idea straight away of a sort of circular idea of one and the other. Okay, and then compare how this idea is explored in the text. So again, we've got this question of compare how this particular idea, so this idea is the circular idea, is explored in the text. So that's asking us for the evidence. Is explored is asking us for the evidence. So why don't you have a go and see whether you can start by grabbing some synonyms for these key parts of the prompt. And when you've done that, then we will move on. So have a quick go at that. Okay, so maybe this is sort of how you produce some ideas for synonyms and stuff. So in terms of uncertainty, you may have been able to list out doubt, dilemma, reservations, queries, questions, clarity, unpredictability, and so on and so on. For breeds, it could be fosters or creates, produces, encourages, or makes. And then for fear, we have this idea of panic, being afraid, dread, terror, alarm, fright, horror, distress. And again, this is just brainstorming, and it breeds further uncertainty. In terms of this idea, as I said, is this kind of circular idea. Uncertainty creates fear, fear in turn creates more uncertainty, and you have this kind of circular motion going on. And then explored, okay, is the prompt for evidence, which is your stakeholders, families, relatives, individuals, friends, groups, and leaders. And again, what we're doing here is we're just trying to prompt our brains to brainstorm and keep focus on what the prompt wants us to consider for the two texts. So in this case, we're thinking about the kinds of doubts or dilemmas that our certain stakeholders will have, which causes them to produce or make or whatever fear, being afraid or having terror or being in distress, and that in turn causes them to become more uncertain. So then we come down to the idea again to link these ideas to the two texts, and that's when your year of study and knowledge accrual will help you identify what it is you need to talk about in context of this. And that in turn will then allow you to move on to step 2, insights, differences, and similarities. Okay, we'll have a look at one more question, just an example, before we finish. Okay, let's have a look at one more. Okay, so you turn over the exam paper and this is the prompt that you are looking at, and you break it down straight away. So compare the ways, okay, the text examine. Okay, so there's your question word and the prompt for evidence. I can write that down, just write down there, evidence, for example. Okay, which is your stakeholders. The preservation of morality omits accusation and condemnation. So what we're looking at here is some key words that we need to write synonyms for. And that will allow us to really get on track and have our brains focused on what it is we need to be looking at and looking for in the knowledge of the text that we have. So preservation, synonyms for preservation, synonyms for morality, synonyms for accusation, and synonyms for condemnation. Can you have a go and see whether you can write a list of a few of those? And then we'll come back and have a look at the ones that I came up with. Okay, so this is how I broke this particular prompt down. Examine here is the evidence from the stakeholders. So again, the same kinds of groups. I start to think of the text that we know in terms of these things, families, friends, individuals, stuff like that. Okay, compare is the question word. Okay, preservation of morality. Okay, so preservation is to keep. We don't need to do too much of that, but morality is one. So morality. Morality covers things like ethics or honesty or principles and values. Integrity, virtues, righteousness, purity, chastity. So these are all good synonyms for morality, and we can start to think about what ideas from the two texts have we learned or covered which have these ideas of ethics or values or virtues within the text. How are they relevant, and how can we use them in this particular question? Okay, amidst accusation. Okay, so if we come up with some synonyms for accusation, is allegations, complaints, charge of something, indictments, insinuations, incriminations, recriminations, all synonyms for accusation. Allegations of cavorting with the devil, for example, in the Crucible, or witchcraft. Charge of theft of land, for example, in the Crucible, Putnam and Proctor. Okay, so there's accusations there, and we're starting to think of how these relate to the text. Condemnation, if we think of synonyms, blame, conviction, disapproval, judgment, censure, denunciation. So we start to think of the condemnation, the blame that goes on in the two texts, the disapprovals, the judgments of different people in the text, stuff like that. So these synonyms, breaking up this prompt, are forcing us to think about how it relates to the two texts and our knowledge that we have of them. It keeps us relevant and it keeps us accurate. And from there, we can start to list down some of the insights, differences and similarities between the two texts in context of this prompt. Okay, so I hope that sort of helps frame what I'm talking about when I say unpack the prompt. Is follow these quick steps, write down some synonyms, and it will help you identify and brainstorm what it is you need to be thinking about right from the start. Okay, I hope that helps. We'll come back and we'll start to look at how we build up some of those differences and similarities and how those then translate into topic sentences. Okay, thanks a lot.